Don Prothero, who also wrote a book on evolution that I think is very good, and he's here.
Yeah, I've tried to meet Don. Yeah, if any of you have not, if you want to really learn the fossil evidence for evolution, Don Prothero, I've highlighted him in my blog. What? Oh, is that Don? Okay, there he is.
Yeah, I have one more.
If you want, I have one chapter on the fossils, so does Richard. Don has a whole book on it, which I consider the best book ever written on the fossil evidence for evolution. It's accessible to the layperson. I highly recommend that if you have any interest in the evidence for evolution, you buy this book. And I didn't mention it in my talk, but that is where you're going to find a huge book on the fossil evidence for evolution, and also attacks on creationism as well. It's on sale outside to the left, that I would recommend buying it. So.
I have one actual question.
Sure.
If birds evolved from dinosaurs, I don't know what the spread was. In other words, did all birds evolve from a few species of dinosaurs? Or did each bird come from a different species of dinosaurs? Or
well,
what?
I mean, that's a good question. And the answer is, at least as best we know now from the DNA evidence, all birds evolved from a single species of dinosaurs. That was something probably like one of these guys. But the common ancestor between birds and dinosaurs was earlier on. It didn't look anything like a bird. It was just an undistinguished dinosaur. One of its descendants went on to form all modern birds, the other modern dinosaurs.
Thank you.
Sure.
You mentioned that there had been over 300 cases of real-time natural selection observed so far.
Yes.
Were none of them speciation, though? You didn't say anything on that.
Speciation, yeah. That's a little bit harder because to see a splitting event, you have to sort of be there at the time. And in my book, I don't want to keep telling you to buy my book, but briefly, there are cases of speciation that we've actually been able to see in about 20 or 30 years, involving flowering plants in Great Britain and elsewhere. This is one of the cases that I gave you. We have many other cases of splitting, but they're nowhere as numerous as, we don't have thousands of them. But we have enough to show that branching occurred. And we also have this inferential evidence that we have evidence that things like birds and reptiles came from common ancestors. And that alone will show you that there must have been a splitting event that occurred in the past. But we actually have seen it in real time. So.
Well, it goes without saying that the statistic for our country is just embarrassing. I mean, the fact that it's even a debate whether evolution is true. But how do you attack, there's so many religious schools. You get young, impressionable minds going to school or with what their parents told them about God in mind, and then, what they think is only reiterated in school. So they go on to become the population of our country that doesn't believe in evolution. I mean, how do you attack that without the religious people freaking out about taking away their schools?
Where do you start educating kids in a way that they'll be accepting evolution? P.Z. Myers was asked this question yesterday, and I agree with his answer, which is, you don't teach them evolution, you teach them rational thinking or critical thinking at a young age.
But what about in the religious schools?
Then when you get up, I found that this actually works because I had a class at the University of Maryland where I taught. It was a confusing class. It was called Creation versus Evolution. On Monday, I would get up and say, here's the evidence for radiometric dating. On Wednesday, I'd get up and say, well, everything I told you on Monday was bullshit. Radiometric dating is all a scam and everything like that. And then on Friday, we'd sit down and discuss the stuff. And over time, the kids began to realize, hey, if you really look at how you analyze stuff, this evolution stuff makes a lot more sense. So I think, to teach kids the fossil record and embryology and stuff in kindergarten and elementary school, which is where you have to do, is really a hard task. But what you can do is teach them to how to think rationally and critically. And I think after that, the evolution will come. So.
Earlier, you were talking about the common ancestor. Is there any scientific evidence of a common ancestor shared by all of us? As in, where we all started from.
By we, do you mean
everything, all species.
Yeah.
The first species. Is there any?
There is. Well, the evidence really is not that we see the traces of it, because it would have been a soft-bodied molecule, something like an RNA molecule. Richard talks a lot more about this in his book than I do. But the evidence that we do share a common ancestor comes from a number of things, the most telling of which is that we all have the same DNA code. And that's highly improbable that would have been evolved independently in exactly the same way. And the way we all use L amino acids and things, this all comes together to indicate that life originated just once.
And is there any explanation for how we all started? How there was nothing living and then there were living organisms that evolved?
Yeah, that's the science of that's more You mean how life started in the first place?
Yeah.
We're making a lot of progress in that, but and in fact, we may be able to create life in the lab. I think we will in the next 20 years. That doesn't mean that... Mike! Jeez. Sorry about that. Hello? That's a problem which I think we have to be worried about because I don't think we're ever going to solve it. We can replicate the origin of life in the lab, and I think we'll do that within the next 20 years, but that doesn't tell us that that's the way it happened. We can get closer to theories about how it originated, but since it was a one-time event 3.5 billion years ago, all we can do is make inferences about how it happened. And like all scientists, there are just some questions I think that we have to accept that we're never going to know the answer to. But there is no doubt that it only happened once. So, to answer your question.
Thank you.
Sure. Is there any more time? All right.
In addressing better society, taking care of our people,
Yeah.
we really have minority rule in California and in the nation. If you think of the Senate, where the 40 senators or 41 senators can kill anything, just about. And in California, you need a 2/3 vote to even pass the budget.
Yeah, well, this is what's going on with healthcare in our country now, where 65%, as Bill Maher said, 65% of Americans want a public option for healthcare, and yet it's being blocked purely by political considerations. Well, I'm not a politician.
Yeah,
I'm a scientist. I think that's an abysmal and horrible situation.
Rule. There's going to be a ballot issue coming up to say majority rule only. 51% passes anything.
Yeah, but again, whether the majority of the Democratic House or Senate is going to go for a public option is, a different situation. I never thought I'd be given a talk in which I connected healthcare with Darwinism, but yeah, that's the last question. Okay, sorry.
You spoke earlier about the correlation between social dysfunction and the belief in God.
Yes.
Do you think there's any correlation between, or do you think that religious belief actually keeps societies dysfunctional in some ways?
Yeah.
And including in our society with the people who tend to disagree with the health care tend to also be creationists and, the birthers and that sort of thing.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. You're absolutely right. I mean, political considerations are definitely making us dysfunctional. The opposition to abortion is religiously based. The opposition to health care, a lot of that is, it all tends to be the same people. Another example of how religion is destroying our society is global warming. A lot of the people that oppose global warming are religiously based people. That doesn't mean, however, that the difference in all those societies and how functional they are results from how religious they are. I think it may be the other way around. So I think if we're going to improve our country, the best way to do it is not to fight and get rid of religion, although I spend a lot of my time doing it. So does Richard. I think it's important to put a lot of our efforts into making this a better society in other ways. Thinking rationally, of course, is one way to do that. Another way is to get out there and lobby for health care. So.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.